Every parent knows the crushing weight of watching their child's dreams crumble because they simply can't afford what other families consider basic necessities. Marcus Rivera felt that suffocating burden every morning as he watched his 9-year-old daughter Sofia pretend that her art supplies didn't matter, that the faded hand-me-down clothes were perfectly fine, that eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner again was actually her favorite meal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When Marcus received word that his estranged Aunt Elena had left him her old industrial warehouse in the forgotten district of Cleveland, neighbors couldn't help but snicker. The massive brick structure hadn't been used in decades. Its windows were boarded up, and rust stains painted abstract patterns down its weathered walls. Local real estate agents shook their heads, muttering that the demolition costs alone would bankrupt what was left of Marcus's already strained finances. He'd been laid off from the automotive plant 6 months earlier, and this felt like the universe's cruel joke at his expense. But Sofia discovered something hidden within those crumbling walls that would silence every doubter and transform their lives forever. What they found inside that abandoned warehouse was worth more than most people earn in 10 lifetimes, a secret that had been carefully concealed for over half a century. Would Marcus be able to protect their incredible discovery from those who would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves? Marcus Rivera had always believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, but at 34, that faith had been severely tested. The cramped apartment in East Cleveland that he shared with Sofia felt more like a prison than a home, its thin walls unable to block out the sounds of neighbors arguing or the constant hum of traffic from the highway that never seemed to sleep. The rent was 3 months behind, and his landlord's patience had worn as thin as the carpet beneath their feet. 6 months ago, Marcus had been a reliable fixture at Henderson Auto Parts, where he'd worked the assembly line for 8 years. The pay wasn't spectacular, but it had been steady, predictable, enough to keep food on the table and maintain the illusion that they were building towards something better. Then the company announced massive layoffs, citing overseas competition and rising costs, and Marcus found himself among the first wave of casualties. The supervisor had delivered the news with practiced sympathy, but sympathy didn't pay bills or ease the growing anxiety that kept Marcus awake most nights. Sofia had absorbed the change with the remarkable resilience that children often display when their world shifts beneath them. At 9 years old, she possessed an artistic talent that reminded Marcus painfully of her mother, Elena, who had passed away when Sofia was barely 3. The girl could lose herself for hours with whatever art supplies they could afford, transforming blank paper into vibrant worlds that seemed to hold more hope than their actual circumstances allowed. But Marcus noticed how Sofia had stopped asking for new colored pencils when her old ones wore down to nubs, how she made her sketch pads last twice as long by drawing smaller and smaller pictures, how she never complained when he said they couldn't afford art classes like her classmates took. The call about Aunt Elena's death had come on a gray Tuesday morning, while Marcus was hunched over his laptop, scrolling through job listings that all seemed to require skills he hadn't developed or experience he couldn't afford to gain. The voice belonged to an attorney named Robert Castellanos, calling from a small firm in downtown Cleveland that specialized in estate planning for what he diplomatically called modest inheritances. "Mr. Rivera, I'm calling about your aunt, Elena Vasquez. I'm sorry to inform you that she passed away last Thursday." Marcus stared at his phone, trying to process the information. Aunt Elena had been his mother's older sister, a woman he'd met perhaps 5 times in his entire life. She'd been an eccentric figure in family stories, someone who'd never married, never had children, and had spent decades working various jobs around Cleveland's industrial district. The last time Marcus had seen her was at his mother's funeral 7 years ago, where Elena had stood apart from the rest of the family, her silver hair pulled back severely, and her dark eyes holding secrets that she'd never shared. "I'm sorry to hear that," Marcus said, and he genuinely meant it, though he wasn't sure why the news affected him. "When is the service?" "It was yesterday. A very small affair as she requested. But Mr. Rivera, there's something else. You're named in her will quite specifically, actually. She's left you her primary asset." Marcus felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of hope and dread. In his experience, unexpected inheritances were usually more burden than blessing, especially from relatives who'd lived on the margins of conventional society. "What kind of asset are we talking about?" "A warehouse property in the Flats district. It's been in her name for about 30 years, though I understand it hasn't been operational for quite some time. The building needs significant work, And the neighborhood isn't what most people would call desirable, but it's yours if you want it. Marcus closed his laptop and walked to the kitchen window that offered a view of the apartment complex's parking lot, where his 12-year-old Honda sat next to a dumpster that always seemed to overflow. A warehouse in the flats meant industrial Cleveland, the area where old manufacturing had gone to die slowly over several decades. It probably meant property taxes he couldn't afford, maintenance costs that would bankrupt him, and headaches that would compound his already overwhelming problems. "Can I see the property before I decide whether to accept it?" he asked. "Of course. I can meet you there tomorrow afternoon if you'd like. Fair warning, though. Mr. Rivera, the building has been empty for years, and it shows. You might be better off selling the land and using whatever proceeds you can get for something more practical." That evening, Marcus sat at their small kitchen table, helping Sofia with homework, while silently debating whether to even bother viewing Elena's inheritance. Math worksheets and spelling lists felt surreal when measured against the possibility that a relative he'd barely known might have left him something valuable, but his experience with unexpected developments had taught him to expect disappointment rather than salvation. "Dad, you look worried," Sofia observed, looking up from her arithmetic problems with the kind of perceptiveness that always surprised him. "Is everything okay?" Marcus considered how much to share with his daughter. Sofia had already absorbed more adult concerns than any child should have to carry, but she deserved honesty about changes that might affect their situation. "Remember Aunt Elena, Mom's sister? She passed away, and she left me a building. I'm going to look at it tomorrow to see if it's something that might help us." Sofia's eyes brightened with the kind of optimism that Marcus both envied and wanted to protect. "What kind of building?" "An old warehouse. It probably needs a lot of work, but maybe we can sell it and use the money to get caught up on bills and find a better place to live." "Can I come with you to see it?" Marcus's first instinct was to refuse. Abandoned industrial buildings weren't safe places for children, and he had no idea what condition Elena's warehouse might be in after years of neglect. But something in Sofia's expression reminded him that this potential inheritance was as much about her future as his own, and she'd already proven herself remarkably mature about their financial struggles. "If you promise to stay close to me and be very careful, yes. But it's probably just going to be a big, empty building that needs more money than we have to fix it up." Sofia nodded seriously, but Marcus could see excitement building behind her. "Careful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Composure. For a child who spent most of her time in cramped spaces, the idea of exploring a massive warehouse probably seemed like an adventure, regardless of its practical implications. The next afternoon, they met attorney Castellanos at the address he'd provided in the Flats district, an area of Cleveland that had seen better days decades earlier. The neighborhood was a mixture of abandoned industrial buildings, struggling small businesses, and vacant lots where torn-down structures had left rectangular scars in the urban landscape. Marcus's Honda looked almost luxurious compared to some of the vehicles parked along the cracked sidewalks, and he found himself checking that the doors were locked more frequently than usual. Elena's warehouse sat on a corner lot, its red brick exterior weathered by decades of Cleveland winters and industrial pollution. The building was enormous, probably 40,000 square feet spread across 2 stories, with loading docks that faced a street where weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt. Rust stains created abstract patterns down the walls where old gutters had failed, and several windows on the upper level had been boarded up with plywood that had itself begun to deteriorate. "It's bigger than I expected," Marcus said, studying the structure with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Elena owned it free and clear," Castellanos explained, consulting his paperwork. "She bought it in 1992 when the previous tenant went out of business. From what I understand, she used parts of it for storage over the years, but most of the space has been empty for a long time." Sofia had been unusually quiet since they'd arrived, but now she tugged on Marcus's sleeve and pointed toward the building's facade. "Dad, look at the bricks up there. They make a pattern." Marcus followed his daughter's gaze and realized she was right. What he'd initially dismissed as random wear and discoloration actually formed deliberate designs in the brickwork, evidence of craftsmanship from an era when even industrial buildings were constructed with aesthetic consideration. The warehouse had probably been built in the 1920s or 1930s, when Cleveland's manufacturing sector was booming and architects still believed that functional buildings could also be beautiful. "Can we go inside?" Sofia asked, her artistic eye clearly intrigued by details that Marcus had missed entirely. Castellanos produced a set of keys that looked as old as the building itself. "The electricity was shut off years ago, but I brought flashlights. Be careful where you step, the floors are solid, but there might be debris or uneven surfaces." The main entrance required significant effort to open, its heavy steel door scraping against accumulated grime as it swung inward. The interior was dim despite afternoon sunlight filtering through dirty windows, and their footsteps echoed in the vast space like whispers in a cathedral. The warehouse floor stretched out before them, interrupted only by massive support columns that rose toward a ceiling lost in shadows. "It's like a castle," Sofia whispered, her voice carrying further than seemed possible in the enormous room. Marcus had to admit that the space was impressive, even in its current condition. The construction was solid, built to last forever, and the proportions created a sense of grandeur that transcended the building's humble industrial purpose. With proper cleaning, adequate lighting, and significant investment, the warehouse could potentially be converted into something valuable. Artist studios, small manufacturing spaces, event venues. The possibilities were intriguing even if they were financially impossible. "Elena left some personal belongings in the office area," Castellanos said, leading them toward a section of the building where walls created smaller rooms within the larger structure. "Nothing of significant value, but you'll want to go through everything before deciding what to do with the property." The office space consisted of 3 rooms that had probably housed the warehouse's administrative functions during its operational years. Lena had clearly used one room as a makeshift living space, with a small bed, hot plate, and portable heater, suggesting that she'd spent considerable time in the building despite maintaining a regular apartment elsewhere in the city. Personal belongings were scattered throughout boxes of papers, old photographs, and what appeared to be decades of accumulated possessions that would need to be sorted through and disposed of. "Why do you think she spent so much time here?" Sofia asked, examining old books stacked on makeshift shelves. Marcus studied the evidence of his aunt's activities, trying to understand what had drawn her to spend so many hours in an otherwise empty warehouse. The room felt like a retreat, a private space where Elena had pursued interests or activities that she'd kept separate from her public life. Art books, foreign language dictionaries, and what appeared to be correspondence in several languages suggested intellectual pursuits that didn't match the family stories about Elena working blue-collar jobs throughout her adult life. Maybe she liked having space to think, Marcus suggested, though he sensed there was more to the story than simple solitude. They spent 2 hours exploring the warehouse, with Sofia's enthusiasm growing as she discovered new details about the building's construction and history. She found old murals painted on walls in what had probably been break areas, evidence of workers who'd spent years in the building and left small traces of their personalities behind. She identified architectural features that Marcus would have overlooked, pointing out decorative elements and craftsmanship that suggested the warehouse had been designed by someone who cared about beauty as well as function. "Dad, can we keep it?" Sofia asked as they prepared to leave, her voice hopeful, despite Marcus's obvious concerns about the property's condition and their inability to afford its restoration. "We'll see, mija. First, I need to understand what it would cost to bring the building up to code and figure out whether we can afford the property taxes and insurance." Castellanos locked the door behind them and handed Marcus the keys along with Elena's will and related documentation. "Take your time deciding," he said. "The inheritance is yours regardless, but you'll want to think carefully about whether accepting ownership makes financial sense given your current situation." That evening, Marcus and Sofia sat at their kitchen table reviewing the documents Castellanos had provided while eating dinner that consisted primarily of items from their nearly empty refrigerator. The warehouse represented both opportunity and risk in proportions that Marcus couldn't easily calculate, and he found himself torn between practical caution and Sofia's obvious excitement about the possibilities. "Look at this, Dad," Sofia said, studying one of Elena's old photographs. "That's the warehouse, but it looks different." Marcus examined the black and white photograph, which showed the building during what was probably its operational heyday. Trucks lined up at the loading docks. Workers moved purposefully between the vehicles and the warehouse entrance, and everything looked clean, organized, and prosperous. The contrast with the building's current condition was stark, but it also suggested that restoration might be more feasible than he'd initially assumed. Elena must have been proud of owning it, Sofia observed. She kept all these pictures and papers about the building. Marcus flipped through Elena's files, finding property records, maintenance receipts, and correspondence that painted a picture of someone who'd been deeply invested in preserving the warehouse, despite its apparent lack of use. The documentation was meticulous, suggesting that Elena had understood the building's value even when others might have dismissed it as obsolete industrial infrastructure. Maybe we should go back tomorrow and look more carefully, Sofia suggested. There might be things we missed. Marcus considered his daughter's proposal. They certainly couldn't afford to hire professional inspectors or contractors to evaluate the property, but a more thorough exploration might reveal details that would help him make an informed decision about whether to keep the inheritance or try to sell it immediately. Sofia's artistic eye had already spotted details that he'd overlooked, and her enthusiasm was infectious enough to make him more optimistic about the possibilities. Okay, he agreed. We'll go back tomorrow after school, but you have to promise to be extra careful. Old buildings can be dangerous, and I don't want you getting hurt while we're exploring. Sofia's smile was worth the risk, and Marcus found himself hoping that Elena's gift might somehow provide the fresh start that he and his daughter desperately needed. The following afternoon brought an unseasonably warm October day that made their return to the warehouse feel less like a burden and more like an adventure. Marcus had borrowed a better flashlight from his neighbor and packed bottled water and snacks, treating their exploration more systematically than their initial hurried survey. Sofia brought her sketchbook, planning to document interesting features that caught her attention. Where should we start? Marcus asked as they stood in the warehouse's main floor area, sunlight streaming through high windows and creating patterns on the concrete floor. Let's look at the upstairs, Sofia suggested. Yesterday we only saw the main floor and the offices. The staircase to the second level was solid despite its age, leading to a mezzanine area that offered views over the entire warehouse floor. The upper level had probably been used for offices or storage, with several rooms that were smaller than the vast space below but still generous by normal standards. Most were empty, but one room near the back of the building contained stacks of covered objects that Elena had apparently stored there over the years. What do you think is under those sheets? Sofia asked, approaching the covered items with curiosity that Marcus didn't entirely share. Probably old furniture or equipment that Elena didn't want to throw away, he said. But his daughter was already lifting the corner of one cloth covering. Dad, you need to see this. The reverence in Sofia's voice made Marcus approach more quickly than he'd intended. Beneath the sheet was an easel, holding a canvas that depicted a street scene in what appeared to be Paris, painted in a style that looked remarkably sophisticated. The brushwork was confident and skilled, the colors still vibrant despite the painting's apparent age, and the overall composition suggested an artist who'd understood both technique and emotion. Did Aunt Elena paint this? Sofia asked, studying the work with the intensity she usually reserved for her own art projects. Marcus examined the canvas more closely, looking for a signature or other identifying marks. In the bottom right corner, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were initials that didn't match Elena's name. E.M., followed by what appeared to be a date from the 1960s. I don't think so, he said, but she must have collected it from somewhere. Sofia was already moving to the next covered item, her excitement building as she discovered another easel with another painting. This one showed a woman in a blue dress sitting by a window, painted in a style that seemed both classical and modern, with lighting effects that made the subject appear almost three-dimensional. Dad, there are more. Marcus helped Sofia uncover the rest of the stored items, revealing a collection of paintings that took his breath away. Landscapes, portraits, abstract compositions, still life studies. Each piece demonstrated remarkable skill and artistic vision. Some appeared to be quite old, while others looked more recent, but all showed evidence of serious artistic talent and careful preservation. Why would Elena keep all these paintings hidden upstairs? Sofia wondered, moving between the works with obvious appreciation for their quality. Marcus studied the collection, trying to understand what he was seeing. The paintings were clearly valuable, not just sentimentally but potentially financially as well. The craftsmanship was museum quality, and several pieces bore signatures or markings that suggested they might be the work of established artists. But why would Elena have accumulated such a collection without displaying it, or even mentioning its existence to family members? Maybe she was protecting them, he said, thinking aloud. Some of these look like they might be worth quite a bit of money. Sofia was examining one painting that showed children playing in a garden, rendered with a warmth and precision that made the scene feel alive despite being frozen on canvas. This one reminds me of the pictures Mom used to show me of when she was little. The mention of Elena brought a sudden realization that made Marcus's pulse quicken. His late wife had often mentioned that her mother's sister had lived an interesting life, working various jobs throughout Cleveland, and always seeming to know more about art and culture than her working-class background would suggest. Elena had never married or had children, devoting herself instead to pursuits that the family had never fully understood or appreciated. "Sofia, I think we need to research these paintings," Marcus said, feeling a mixture of excitement and anxiety about what they might discover. Some of them might be worth more than we realize. They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully examining each piece, with Sofia making detailed sketches in her notebook, while Marcus photographed the signatures and any other identifying marks. The collection included nearly 50 paintings in various sizes and styles, all apparently dating from the mid-20th century forward, and all showing evidence of professional quality artistry. "Can we bring some of them home to research?" Sofia asked as they prepared to leave the warehouse. Marcus hesitated, concerned about transporting valuable artwork in his aging Honda, but he recognized that they needed to understand what Elena had left them before making any decisions about the warehouse's future. They carefully selected 3 smaller paintings that seemed representative of the collection's overall quality and wrapped them in old blankets they found in Elena's office area. That evening, Marcus and Sofia spread the paintings across their small living room and began searching online for information about the signatures and styles they'd documented. What they discovered made Marcus's hands tremble as he scrolled through auction records and art history websites. The initials EM that appeared on several paintings matched Edmund Morrison, a Cleveland-based artist whose work had gained national recognition in the 1960s and whose pieces now sold for significant sums at major auction houses. Another signature corresponded to Maria Santos, a Cuban-American painter whose canvases were displayed in museums throughout the southeastern United States. A third set of initials led to Roberto Chen, whose abstract compositions had been featured in important exhibitions throughout the 1980s and 1990s. "Dad, this painting by Maria Santos sold for $80,000 last year," Sofia said, reading from an auction website with barely contained excitement. Marcus stared at the screen, trying to process the implications of what they were discovering. If the paintings in Elena's warehouse were authentic works by recognized artists, then his aunt had accumulated a collection that could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly millions depending on the total number of significant pieces. "We need to be very careful about this," he said, though his mind was racing with possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. "We need to have the paintings authenticated by experts before we can be sure they're genuine." Sofia nodded seriously, but her eyes sparkled with excitement that matched Marcus's own growing sense that their lives were about to change dramatically. "Should we go back tomorrow and look at more of them?" Marcus glanced toward their kitchen, where unpaid bills sat in a stack that seemed to grow larger every day, then back at the paintings that might represent salvation from their financial struggles. "Yes," he said, "we need to catalog everything Elena left us and figure out exactly what we've inherited." As father and daughter worked late into the evening, researching artists and auction records, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope, real, tangible hope, that their circumstances might improve, that Sofia's future might hold possibilities he'd been afraid to imagine, that Elena's unexpected gift might indeed provide the fresh start they desperately needed. But even as optimism grew, a nagging worry persisted in the back of Marcus's mind. Collections like this didn't accumulate by accident, and people didn't hide valuable artwork in abandoned warehouses without good reason. He found himself wondering what Elena had known about these paintings, how she'd acquired them, and why she'd chosen to keep them secret from her family for so many years. The answers to those questions would have to wait until tomorrow, but Marcus suspected that Elena's legacy was more complex and potentially more dangerous than a simple inheritance of valuable artwork. For tonight, though, it was enough to believe that his daughter's artistic talents might have led them to a discovery that would transform their lives in ways neither of them could yet fully comprehend. The next morning brought a reality check that tempered Marcus's overnight optimism about their discovery. While researching authentication procedures for fine art, he learned that the process could take months and cost thousands of dollars that he didn't have. Professional appraisals, provenance research, scientific analysis of paint and canvas, all of it required expertise and resources that were currently beyond his reach. "How much does it cost to find out if the paintings are real?" Sofia asked over breakfast, having listened to her father's phone conversations with art authentication services. "More than we can afford right now," Marcus admitted, "but that doesn't mean we should give up. Maybe we can find a way to get some preliminary opinions without spending too much money." Sofia finished her cereal and gathered her school supplies, but Marcus could see that she was thinking hard about their situation. At 9 years old, she'd already learned to balance optimism with practical concerns, a skill that Marcus wished she hadn't needed to develop so early. "Dad, what if we showed the paintings to art teachers at the college? They might know about these artists, and they probably wouldn't charge us just to look at them." Marcus paused in his morning routine, struck by his daughter's suggestion. Cleveland State University had a respected art program, and faculty members there would certainly be more qualified than Marcus to offer preliminary assessments of Elena's collection. Even if they couldn't provide definitive authentication, they might be able to identify which pieces were worth pursuing professional evaluation. "That's actually a really good idea, Mia. Let me see if I can make some appointments for this weekend." After dropping Sofia at school, Marcus spent his morning making phone calls to Cleveland State's art department. His explanation of the situation sounded almost unbelievable even to himself. Unemployed single father discovers cache of potentially valuable paintings in inherited warehouse, seeks expert opinion on collection that might be worth millions, but could also be elaborate reproductions. Professor Catherine Walsh, who specialized in 20th century American art, agreed to meet with Marcus on Saturday morning. Her voice carried professional skepticism, but also genuine curiosity about what he might have found. She warned him that most discovered collections turned out to be disappointments, but she was willing to examine whatever he brought to her office. "I can give you preliminary opinions based on style, signature analysis, and historical context," she explained. "But you'll understand that definitive authentication requires much more extensive analysis than I can provide in a single meeting." Friday evening found Marcus and Sofia back at the warehouse, this time equipped with proper lighting and a methodical plan for cataloging Elena's collection. They'd decided to focus on pieces that showed the most obvious signs of professional quality, documenting each painting with detailed photographs before carefully wrapping selected works for transport to their Saturday appointment. "This one looks different from the others," Sofia observed, studying a canvas that depicted an industrial scene with workers and machinery. The style was more realistic than some of the other pieces, but the composition showed the same attention to light and form that characterized the collection's strongest works. Marcus examined the painting's signature, finding initials that didn't immediately match any of the artists they'd researched. "JR 1955 was written in small letters along the bottom edge, barely visible unless you looked at the canvas from a specific angle. Maybe Professor Walsh will recognize the artist," he said, adding the piece to their selection for Saturday's evaluation. They worked until nearly midnight, documenting 47 paintings of various sizes and subject matters. The diversity of the collection was remarkable, ranging from traditional landscapes to bold abstract compositions, suggesting that Elena had either been an unusually knowledgeable collector or had acquired the works through circumstances that Marcus couldn't yet understand. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn in Cleveland, and Marcus found himself more nervous than he'd expected as he and Sofia loaded 8 carefully selected paintings into his Honda. The works represented the best examples they'd found of different artistic styles and time periods, hopefully providing Professor Walsh with a representative sample of Elena's collection. Cleveland State University's art building was a modern structure that contrasted sharply with the warehouse where they'd made their discovery. Professor Walsh met them in a conference room equipped with professional lighting and magnification equipment, her manner friendly but businesslike as she prepared to examine what they'd brought. "Let's start with something that immediately catches my attention," she said, unwrapping the industrial scene that Sofia had noticed the previous evening. Her reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her eyes widened and she leaned closer to examine the signature and brushwork with obvious recognition. "Where did you say you found this?" she asked, her professional composure slipping slightly. "In my aunt's warehouse." She never mentioned having any art collection, but we found all of these paintings stored upstairs under protective covers. Professor Walsh was studying the canvas with a magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the signature and the painting's surface texture. Mr. Rivera, if this is authentic, you're looking at a work by Jacob Rosenberg, one of Cleveland's most important 20th century artists. His paintings rarely come to market, and when they do, they sell for substantial sums. Marcus felt his heartbeat accelerate. How substantial? This particular piece, if it's genuine, could be worth anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000, depending on its provenance and condition. Sofia grabbed Marcus's arm, her excitement barely contained as Professor Walsh moved to examine the next painting. The Maria Santos canvas that they'd already researched online drew an even stronger reaction from the art professor, who immediately reached for reference books from her office shelves. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, comparing the painting to reproductions in her art history texts. Maria Santos is represented in major collections throughout the country. Her works almost never appear at private auctions, and I've never heard of anyone in Cleveland owning original Santos pieces. The evaluation continued for 3 hours, with Professor Walsh growing more animated and excited as she examined each painting. By the end of the session, she'd tentatively identified works by 8 different artists, all of whom were represented in museum collections and commanded significant prices in the art market. "Mr. Rivera, you need to understand what you've potentially inherited," she said, as they prepared to leave. "If these paintings are authentic, and if your aunt's collection includes additional works of similar quality, you could be looking at one of the most significant private art collections in the Midwest." Marcus struggled to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. "What kind of value are we talking about?" Professor Walsh consulted her notes, adding figures that made Marcus's head spin. "Based on what I've seen today, these 8 paintings alone could be worth between $2 and $4 million. If the rest of your aunt's collection maintains this quality level, the total value could approach $10 million or more." The numbers were so large that they felt almost meaningless to Marcus, whose recent financial concerns had centered around hundreds of dollars rather than millions. But Sofia's artistic instincts had led them to something that could transform their lives completely, eliminating not just their current financial struggles, but providing security for generations. "What should we do next?" Marcus asked. "First, you need professional security for the collection. Word about discoveries like this travels quickly in the art world, and valuable paintings stored in an unsecured warehouse present obvious risks. Second, you need comprehensive authentication and appraisal by specialists in each artist's work. And third, you need legal advice about the implications of owning such a valuable collection." As they drove home with their paintings carefully secured in the back seat, Marcus and Sofia were unusually quiet, both trying to absorb the reality that their lives had just changed in ways they were still struggling to comprehend. The warehouse that had seemed like a burden just days earlier now represented possibilities that Marcus had never dared to imagine. "Dad," Sofia said finally, "what do you think Aunt Elena would want us to do with the paintings?" It was a question that Marcus had been avoiding, but Sofia's directness forced him to confront the ethical implications of their discovery. Elena had spent decades preserving and protecting this collection, keeping it safe in a warehouse where few people would think to look for valuable artwork. She'd chosen to leave the building to Marcus, but had she expected him to discover what she'd hidden there? Did she intend for the paintings to be sold, or had she hoped they would remain preserved for future generations? "I think she would want us to make sure the art is protected and appreciated," Marcus said carefully. "Beyond that, I'm not sure what her wishes would have been." Sofia nodded, then returned to studying the reproductions of Elena's paintings in Professor Walsh's art books. "Maybe we can keep some of them and share others with museums so more people can see them." Marcus smiled at his daughter's instinctive generosity, recognizing that Sofia had inherited not just Elena's eye for art, but also a sense of responsibility for preserving cultural treasures. Whatever they ultimately decided to do with the collection, they would need to balance their own financial needs against the broader value of keeping important artwork accessible to the public. As they pulled into their apartment complex parking lot, Marcus realized that their old life was ending and something entirely new was beginning. The challenges ahead would be different from the ones they'd been facing, but they would be challenges of opportunity rather than desperation, problems that came from having choices rather than from having none at all. Elena's warehouse had indeed held secrets worth protecting, And now, it was Marcus and Sofia's responsibility to prove themselves worthy of the trust his aunt had placed in them. The little girl whose artistic talents had guided them to this discovery would play a crucial role in determining how their family's sudden fortune would shape not just their own future, but the preservation of cultural treasures that belonged to a much larger community. The euphoria of Professor Walsh's evaluation lasted exactly 48 hours before reality crashed down on Marcus like a cold Cleveland winter. Monday morning brought a visitor who fundamentally changed everything they thought they understood about Elena's collection and their own safety. Marcus was reviewing security company quotes on his laptop when a sharp knock echoed through their apartment. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in an expensive charcoal suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that suggested corporate authority rather than friendly neighborliness. Something about her posture immediately put Marcus on edge. "Mr. Rivera? My name is Victoria Sterling. I represent Meridian Art Acquisitions. I understand you've recently come into possession of some interesting artwork." Marcus opened the door but didn't invite her inside, noting how Sterling's eyes immediately swept past him to examine the interior of their modest apartment. Her gaze lingered on the reproductions from Professor Walsh's books that Sofia had left spread across their coffee table. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Marcus said carefully. Sterling's smile was practiced and cold. "Mr. Rivera, the art world is surprisingly small, especially when significant discoveries are involved. Word travels quickly about collections that surface unexpectedly. We'd like to make you an offer for whatever pieces you've inherited from Elena Vasquez." The fact that she knew Elena's name sent alarm bells ringing in Marcus's mind. He and Sofia had been careful about who they'd spoken with regarding their discovery, limiting their inquiries to Professor Walsh and a few authentication services. Yet somehow this corporate representative had not only learned about the collection, but had tracked down their address within days of their university consultation. "How did you know about my aunt?" Marcus asked. "Meridian maintains extensive databases of significant private collections. Elena Vasquez had been on our radar for many years as someone who might possess valuable artwork. When estate records showed that she'd left property to a relative, we naturally became interested in making contact." Marcus studied Sterling's expression, searching for tells that might reveal how much she actually knew about Elena's collection. The woman's confidence suggested she understood exactly what she was pursuing, but her eagerness to make an immediate offer indicated that she might not have complete information about the scope or value of what they'd found. "What kind of offer are we talking about?" Marcus asked, curious to understand Meridian's assessment of the situation. Sterling reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder containing what appeared to be a standard purchase agreement. "We're prepared to offer $2 million for the complete collection, sight unseen. The transaction could be completed within 72 hours, with payment transferred immediately upon signing." The figure was substantial enough to solve every financial problem Marcus and Sofia currently faced, but it was also significantly lower than Professor Walsh's preliminary estimates for just the 8 paintings they'd shown her. Sterling's willingness to make such an offer without examining the artwork suggested that Meridian believed the collection was worth considerably more than they were proposing to pay. "That seems like a decision that requires careful consideration," Marcus said diplomatically. Sterling's demeanor shifted subtly, her corporate pleasantness acquiring a harder edge. "Mr. Rivera, you should understand that valuable art collections sometimes attract unwanted attention from people who don't share Meridian's commitment to legal transactions. The sooner you can resolve ownership of these pieces, the safer you and your family will be." The veiled threat was unmistakable, and Marcus felt his protective instincts surge as he thought about Sofia's safety. But something in Sterling's tone also suggested that she might be more concerned about competition from other buyers than genuinely worried about Marcus's welfare. "I'll need to think about your proposal," Marcus said, already planning to research Meridian Art Acquisitions as thoroughly as possible. "Of course. You have our contact information. But don't wait too long, Mr. Rivera. Opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely." After Sterling left, Marcus immediately called Professor Walsh to report the visit and ask for advice about dealing with corporate art dealers. Her reaction was immediate and alarmed. "Marcus, you need to be extremely careful. Meridian Art Acquisitions has a reputation in the industry that's questionable at best. They specialize in acquiring collections from people who don't understand the true value of what they own, often paying a fraction of market value for pieces that they then resell for enormous profits." "Should I be worried about the safety issue she mentioned?" Professor Walsh was quiet for a moment before responding. There have been cases where valuable art discoveries have attracted criminal attention. But more often, the real danger comes from unscrupulous dealers who use intimidation tactics to pressure people into unfavorable sales. You should definitely take security precautions, but you shouldn't let fear drive you into making hasty decisions. That afternoon, Marcus researched Meridian art acquisitions online, finding a corporate website that looked professional but revealed little about the company's actual business practices. More illuminating were art industry forums, where collectors and dealers discussed various companies' reputations. The comments about Meridian were consistently negative, describing aggressive acquisition tactics, below-market purchase prices, and legal disputes with sellers who later discovered they'd been taken advantage of. When Sofia came home from school, Marcus explained Sterling's visit in terms that conveyed the seriousness of their situation without frightening his daughter unnecessarily. Sofia listened with the focused attention she always brought to adult conversations that affected their family's welfare. "So this lady wants to buy all of Aunt Elena's paintings for less than they're worth?" Sofia asked. "That's what it sounds like." And she seemed to know things about Elena and the collection that she shouldn't have been able to find out so quickly. Sofia frowned, displaying the same intuitive suspicion that had helped them discover the paintings in the first place. Maybe Aunt Elena had problems with people like that before. Maybe that's why she hid the paintings in the warehouse. Marcus paused in his review of Meridian's corporate information, struck by his daughter's insight. Elena had indeed gone to considerable trouble to conceal her collection, storing valuable artwork in a location where few people would think to look for it. The elaborate secrecy suggested that she'd been protecting the paintings from something more serious than simple theft. "You might be right," Marcus said. "Maybe we should look through Elena's papers more carefully to see if she left any information about why she kept the collection hidden." That evening, they returned to the warehouse with a new sense of urgency, focusing their attention on Elena's office area and the personal belongings she'd accumulated over decades of time spent in the building. What they'd initially dismissed as random clutter began to reveal patterns that suggested Elena had been conducting research and maintaining records that went far beyond simple collection management. Sofia discovered a file cabinet hidden behind boxes of books, its contents organized with the same meticulous care that Elena had applied to preserving the paintings themselves. Financial records, correspondence, and newspaper clippings painted a picture of someone who'd been deeply involved in the art world despite maintaining a public persona as a working-class Cleveland resident. "Dad, look at this," Sofia said, holding up a letter dated 15 years earlier. The letterhead belonged to a prestigious New York auction house, and the content discussed Elena's decision to withdraw several paintings from a scheduled sale. Marcus read the letter carefully, noting the auction house's obvious disappointment about Elena's last-minute change of heart. The paintings she'd withdrawn were described in terms that suggested significant value, and the tone of the correspondence indicated that this hadn't been Elena's first interaction with major art dealers. "She was selling some of the paintings," Marcus observed, but then she decided not to. Sofia was already examining other documents from the file, finding evidence of a pattern that extended over many years. Elena had periodically engaged with auction houses and dealers, always ultimately deciding to retain her collection rather than sell pieces that others were eager to acquire. Maybe someone was pressuring her to sell things she didn't want to sell, Sofia suggested. Marcus found a folder labeled Correspondence Meridian that made his blood run cold. The file contained dozens of letters, emails, and even transcripts of recorded phone conversations between Elena and various Meridian representatives spanning more than a decade. The communications revealed an escalating campaign of pressure tactics that had grown increasingly aggressive over time. The early letters were professionally polite, expressing Meridian's interest in acquiring specific pieces from Elena's collection and offering what appeared to be reasonable compensation. But as Elena continued to refuse their offers, the tone shifted dramatically. More recent communications contained barely veiled threats about the dangers of maintaining valuable collections without proper security, suggestions that Elena's age made her vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous dealers, and implications that her family might face consequences if she didn't cooperate with Meridian's acquisition efforts. "They were threatening her," Marcus said, reading through emails that documented years of harassment that Elena had endured while protecting her collection. Sofia was examining photographs that Elena had apparently taken of people she suspected of conducting surveillance on her apartment and the warehouse. Several images showed the same individuals appearing repeatedly near both locations, suggesting organized monitoring rather than casual criminal interest. Aunt Elena knew they were watching her, Sofia said. That's why she hid everything so carefully. Marcus studied the surveillance photographs, recognizing the level of sophistication that would be required to conduct such extensive monitoring over an extended period. Meridian Art Acquisitions was clearly far more than a simple commercial enterprise, if they were willing to invest in long-term surveillance and intimidation campaigns to acquire collections they wanted. The most chilling discovery came in a folder labeled Insurance and Security, which contained Elena's correspondence with lawyers, private investigators, and security consultants about protecting her collection from what she described as corporate theft disguised as legitimate business practices. Elena had apparently spent thousands of dollars on legal advice and security measures, all focused on preventing Meridian from gaining access to her paintings. She was fighting them for years, Marcus realized. And now they're coming after us because they think we don't know what she knew. Sofia was reading through Elena's handwritten notes, which documented her research into Meridian's business practices and their history of acquiring collections from vulnerable sellers. The notes revealed a pattern of targeting elderly collectors, recent inheritors, and people facing financial difficulties, using a combination of below-market offers and intimidation tactics to acquire valuable artwork for a fraction of its worth. "Dad, Elena wrote down phone numbers for people who can help us," Sofia said, pointing to a list of contacts that included lawyers, art experts, and what appeared to be investigative journalists who specialized in art industry corruption. Marcus studied the contact list, recognizing that Elena had essentially prepared a defense strategy for whoever inherited her collection. She'd understood that Meridian would eventually attempt to acquire the paintings from her heirs, and she'd left detailed information about how to resist their pressure tactics and protect the collection's value. But even as Marcus felt grateful for Elena's foresight, he also recognized the magnitude of what they were facing. Meridian had devoted years to pursuing Elena's collection, investing significant resources in surveillance and legal pressure. They weren't going to simply accept Marcus's refusal to sell, especially now that they'd made their interest known and established a timeline for completing the transaction. "We need help," Marcus said, reaching for his phone to call Professor Walsh. "Professional help from people who understand how to deal with companies like Meridian." Professor Walsh listened to Marcus's report about Elena's files with growing alarm, occasionally asking for clarification about specific documents or communications. When he finished describing what they'd discovered, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Marcus, you've inherited more than just a valuable art collection. You've inherited a war that Elena was fighting to protect cultural treasures from corporate predators. And, based on what you're telling me, that war is far from over. What should we do?" "First, you need immediate security for both the collection and your family. Second, you need legal representation that specializes in art law and has experience dealing with companies like Meridian. And third, you need to document everything Elena left you, because her research might be the key to exposing Meridian's illegal practices." That night, Marcus lay awake, listening to Sofia's peaceful breathing from the next room, while contemplating the reality that their discovery had placed them in the crosshairs of people who had spent years pursuing Elena's collection. The $2 million offer that had initially seemed generous now appeared to be exactly what Elena's research suggested, an attempt to acquire priceless artwork for a fraction of its value. But even as anxiety kept him awake, Marcus also felt a growing sense of determination that surprised him with its intensity. Elena had spent decades protecting something she believed was worth preserving, and she'd entrusted that responsibility to him and Sofia. Meridian's aggressive tactics only reinforced his conviction that the collection needed to be protected from corporate interests that valued profit over cultural preservation. The next morning brought news that accelerated their timeline dramatically. Marcus discovered that someone had attempted to break into the warehouse during the night, triggering the basic alarm system that the previous tenant had installed years earlier. Cleveland police had responded to the alarm but found no evidence of forced entry, suggesting that whoever had attempted the break-in possessed sophisticated tools and knowledge of security systems. "They're not waiting for us to decide," Marcus told Professor Walsh when he called to report the incident. "They're already trying to take the collection." "Then we need to move faster than they are," she replied. "I'm calling Dr. James Harrison at the Cleveland Museum of Art. He has experience with situations like this, and he can provide security and authentication services that Meridian won't be able to intimidate or corrupt." Dr. Harrison proved to be exactly the ally they needed. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s with gray hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he brought decades of experience in museum curation and art preservation to their cause. More importantly, he had a reputation in the art world that commanded respect from legitimate dealers while making him immune to the pressure tactics that companies like Meridian typically employed. "Professor Walsh has briefed me on your situation," Dr. Harrison said when they met at the warehouse later that morning. "I want you to understand that what you've inherited isn't just valuable, it's historically significant. Collections like this belong in public institutions where they can be studied, preserved, and appreciated by future generations." Marcus and Sofia led Dr. Harrison through Elena's collection, watching his expression grow more amazed and excited as he examined piece after piece of museum-quality artwork. His preliminary assessment confirmed Professor Walsh's estimates, while revealing additional layers of significance that even she hadn't recognized. "This isn't just a collection of valuable paintings," Dr. Harrison explained as he studied a series of works that depicted Cleveland's industrial development over several decades. "This is a comprehensive artistic documentation of American urban development in the 20th century. The historical value is immeasurable." Sofia was taking notes in her sketchbook, documenting Dr. Harrison's comments about each piece and creating her own artistic responses to paintings that particularly captured her imagination. Marcus watched his daughter engage with the collection on a level that went beyond simple financial interest, recognizing that Sofia understood the cultural significance of what Elena had preserved. "What are our options for protecting the collection?" Marcus asked. Dr. Harrison considered the question carefully. "There are several possibilities. The Cleveland Museum of Art could provide immediate security and authentication services, with the understanding that we'd eventually like to acquire key pieces for our permanent collection. Alternatively, we could help you establish a private foundation that would preserve the collection while maintaining your family's control over its ultimate disposition. What about companies like Meridian?" Companies like Meridian rely on intimidation and information asymmetry to acquire collections below market value. Once a collection receives proper authentication and public attention, their tactics become much less effective. They prefer to operate in shadows, targeting people who don't understand what they own or how to protect it. Dr. Harrison's confidence was reassuring, but Marcus also understood that challenging Meridian would require resources and expertise that went far beyond what he and Sofia could provide on their own. Elena's research had documented years of sophisticated pressure campaigns, and there was no reason to believe that the company would abandon their pursuits simply because the collection had gained museum support. "There's something else you should consider," Dr. Harrison continued. "Elena's documentation of Meridian's practices could be evidence of systematic fraud in the art acquisition industry. The FBI has been investigating several companies for using intimidation and misrepresentation to acquire valuable collections, and Elena's files might provide exactly the evidence they need to build criminal cases." The possibility that their discovery could contribute to stopping Meridian's predatory practices added another dimension to Marcus's sense of responsibility. Elena hadn't just preserved valuable artwork, she'd documented criminal behavior that had affected other collectors and families who'd been pressured into unfavorable sales. "Would that be dangerous for us?" Marcus asked, thinking primarily about Sofia's safety. "It could be," Dr. Harrison admitted, "but it would also provide you with powerful protection. Companies like Meridian become much more cautious when they know their activities are under federal investigation." That afternoon, Dr. Harrison arranged for the immediate transfer of Elena's most valuable pieces to secure storage at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where they would be protected by professional security systems while undergoing comprehensive authentication. The process required careful documentation and photography, creating a permanent record of each piece's condition and provenance. Sofia insisted on participating in every aspect of the transfer, treating the process as an educational opportunity to learn about art preservation and museum practices. Dr. Harrison encouraged her involvement, recognizing that Sofia's artistic sensibilities and emotional connection to the collection made her an invaluable participant in decisions about its future. "Your daughter has an exceptional eye for art," Dr. Harrison told Marcus as they supervised the careful packing of a particularly delicate landscape painting. "She notices details about composition and technique that most adults would miss entirely." Marcus watched Sofia directing the museum's professional art handlers with confidence that belied her age. issuing suggestions about padding and positioning that the experienced technicians accepted with obvious respect. In just a few days, his daughter had evolved from a child who drew pictures in the margins of her homework to someone who was actively participating in the preservation of culturally significant artwork. Elena would be proud of how she's handling this responsibility, Marcus said, feeling a mixture of pride and concern about the adult burdens that Sofia was already shouldering. As evening approached and the most valuable pieces were safely secured at the museum, Marcus received a phone call that reminded him that Meridian wasn't simply going to accept their resistance without escalation. Victoria Sterling's voice carried none of the false pleasantness that had characterized their first meeting. "Mr. Rivera, I understand you've decided to involve outside parties in what should have been a straightforward business transaction. That's unfortunate, because it's going to make resolving this situation much more complicated." "I'm not sure what you mean," Marcus replied, though Sterling's tone made it clear that Meridian was well informed about their activities at the museum. "We know you've moved some of the artwork to the Cleveland Museum of Art. We know you've been consulting with Dr. Harrison and Professor Walsh. And we know you've been reviewing Elena Vasquez's files about our previous communications." The extent of Meridian's surveillance was both impressive and terrifying, suggesting resources and connections that went far beyond what Marcus had imagined a private art acquisition company might possess. They were clearly monitoring his communications, tracking his movements, and possibly observing their activities at both the warehouse and the museum. "What do you want?" Marcus asked. "We want to resolve this before it becomes a public relations nightmare for everyone involved." Elena Vasquez accumulated her collection through questionable means over several decades. If that information becomes public, it could damage the reputation of every institution that's now associated with authenticating her artwork. Sterling's threat was carefully constructed to exploit Marcus's concerns about protecting Elena's legacy, while also suggesting that resistance to Meridian's acquisition efforts would result in public embarrassment and legal complications. But her willingness to attack Elena's reputation also revealed desperation that suggested Marcus and his allies were having more impact than Meridian had anticipated. "I think this conversation is over," Marcus said, recognizing that any further engagement would only provide Meridian with additional information about his plans and vulnerabilities. "Mr. Rivera, you have until tomorrow evening to reconsider our offer. After that, we'll be forced to pursue alternative methods for resolving this situation." The line went dead, leaving Marcus with the unpleasant certainty that Meridian's alternative methods would involve escalated pressure tactics that could threaten both the collection and his family's safety. Elena's files had documented years of harassment and intimidation, and there was no reason to believe that the company would hesitate to use similar tactics against Marcus and Sofia. That evening, Marcus and Sofia met with Dr. Harrison and Professor Walsh at the museum to review their options and develop a strategy for protecting both the collection and themselves from Meridian's increasingly aggressive pursuit. The meeting took place in Dr. Harrison's office, surrounded by reproductions of masterpieces that reminded everyone present of what they were working to preserve. "The good news is that we've successfully established the collection's legitimacy and value," Dr. Harrison reported. "Our preliminary authentication confirms that Elena assembled one of the most significant private collections of 20th-century American art in the Midwest. The bad news is that Meridian clearly isn't going to accept defeat gracefully." Professor Walsh had been researching Meridian's corporate structure and financial backing, discovering connections that explained their ability to conduct sophisticated surveillance and pressure campaigns. Meridian is actually a subsidiary of a larger corporation that specializes in acquiring distressed assets across multiple industries. They have virtually unlimited resources and a track record of using whatever tactics are necessary to complete acquisitions they've targeted. Marcus felt a chill as he contemplated the implications of facing an opponent with unlimited resources and no apparent ethical constraints. Elena had managed to resist their pressure for years, but she'd been a single individual with limited resources fighting a defensive battle. Now Marcus and Sofia were inheriting not just her collection but also her enemies, with the added vulnerability of being inexperienced in dealing with corporate intimidation. "What are our advantages?" Marcus asked, looking for reasons to remain optimistic about their chances. "Documentation," Dr. Harrison replied immediately. "Elena's files provide evidence of systematic criminal behavior that federal law enforcement has been trying to develop for years. Once we turn that information over to the FBI, Meridian's ability to operate freely will be severely constrained." Sofia looked up from her sketchbook, where she'd been drawing portraits of their allies while listening to the adult conversation. "And we have something they don't expect," she added with the insight that had consistently surprised the adults around her. "What's that?" Professor Walsh asked. "We actually care about the paintings more than the money. They're trying to scare us into selling cheap, but they don't understand that we want to protect what Aunt Elena protected." Dr. Harrison smiled at Sofia's observation, recognizing the strategic advantage that came from having pure motivations in a conflict with opponents whose only concern was financial gain. "Your daughter is absolutely right. Meridian's entire strategy depends on people being more concerned about immediate financial benefit than long-term cultural preservation. When that assumption proves false, their tactics become much less effective." As the meeting concluded, Marcus felt a sense of clarity about their path forward that had been missing since Sterling's first visit. They would turn Elena's documentation over to federal authorities, continue working with the museum to authenticate and preserve the collection, and resist any attempts by Meridian to acquire the artwork through intimidation or misrepresentation. The decision felt right in ways that went beyond simple financial calculation. Elena had spent decades protecting something she believed was culturally significant, and she'd trusted Marcus and Sofia to continue that protection. Honoring that trust meant accepting risks that came with challenging powerful interests, but it also meant preserving artwork that belonged to a much larger community than any single collector or corporation. As they prepared to leave the museum, Sofia asked a question that went to the heart of their situation. "Dad, do you think we're doing what Mom would have wanted us to do?" Marcus considered the question seriously, thinking about Elena's values and her commitment to preserving cultural treasures for future generations. His late wife had always encouraged Sofia's artistic interests, believing that creativity and cultural appreciation were essential elements of a meaningful life. "I think she would be proud of how we're handling this responsibility," Marcus said. "And I think she would want us to make sure Elena's collection reaches people who will appreciate and preserve it properly." Sofia nodded, then returned her attention to the museum's galleries, where authentic masterpieces surrounded them with examples of what human creativity could accomplish when properly supported and preserved. The contrast with Meridian's purely commercial approach to art acquisition couldn't have been clearer, and Marcus felt confident that they were fighting for the right side in a conflict that would determine whether Elena's legacy survived intact or disappeared into corporate vaults, where profit mattered more than cultural preservation. The federal agents arrived at the Cleveland Museum of Art on a Tuesday morning that would later be remembered as the day everything changed. Special Agent Rebecca Chen of the FBI's art crime team had been investigating corporate fraud in the art acquisition industry for 3 years, building cases against companies that used intimidation and misrepresentation to acquire valuable collections below market value. Elena's meticulously documented files provided exactly the evidence she needed to move from investigation to prosecution. Marcus and Sofia sat in Dr. Harrison's office while Agent Chin reviewed Elena's documentation, watching the federal investigator's expression grow more intense as she absorbed years of evidence that Elena had carefully preserved. Phone recordings, email transcripts, surveillance photographs, and detailed notes painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior that extended far beyond simple aggressive business practices. "This is extraordinary work," Agent Chin said, looking up from Elena's files with obvious admiration. "Your aunt essentially conducted a 3-year undercover investigation that documents multiple federal crimes: wire fraud, interstate racketeering, criminal conspiracy, possibly even money laundering through art transactions." Sofia was sketching portraits of the FBI agent while listening to the conversation, her artistic attention focused on capturing the determination and intelligence that characterized Agent Chen's demeanor. At 10 years old, Sofia had developed an intuitive understanding of which adults could be trusted to protect what mattered most, and Agent Chen clearly belonged in that category. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, feeling relieved that Elena's burden was finally being shared with people who had the authority and resources to challenge Meridian's criminal activities. "Now we build criminal cases against everyone involved in Meridian's operations," Agent Chen replied. "Your aunt's evidence gives us probable cause for search warrants, asset seizures, and arrests that we've been working toward for years, but I need you to understand that this process will take time, and Meridian will become more dangerous as they realize their activities are under federal scrutiny." Dr. Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious as he considered the implications of Agent Chen's warning. "What kind of protection can you provide for Marcus and Sofia during the investigation? We can offer witness protection services if the threat level escalates to that point." In the meantime, we'll establish surveillance to monitor Meridian's activities and document any attempts to intimidate or threaten people connected to this case. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as he contemplated the reality that his family was now under federal protection while also being at the center of a criminal investigation that could take months or years to resolve. The collection that had initially seemed like salvation from their financial problems had evolved into something far more complex, with implications that reached beyond their personal circumstances to affect the entire art acquisition industry. "Agent Chen," Sofia said, looking up from her sketchbook with the directness that always characterized her most important questions. "Will the bad people go to jail?" The FBI agent smiled at Sofia's straightforward approach to complex legal issues. "If we can prove they committed the crimes or aren't documented, yes. Many of them will go to jail for a very long time." Sofia nodded with satisfaction, then returned to her artistic work with the focused concentration that had led them to discover Elena's collection in the first place. Marcus watched his daughter process information about criminal investigations and federal prosecutions with remarkable equanimity, recognizing that Sofia had developed resilience and wisdom that would serve her well regardless of how their situation ultimately resolved. Agent Chen spent the rest of the morning reviewing Elena's documentation with Dr. Harrison and Professor Walsh, identifying specific pieces of evidence that would be most valuable for building criminal cases against Meridian's leadership. The process revealed additional layers of complexity in Elena's situation that none of them had previously understood. "Your aunt wasn't just protecting her own collection," Agent Chen explained as she organized Elena's files for transfer to FBI custody. "She was documenting a criminal enterprise that has victimized dozens of collectors across multiple states. Some of the people Meridian pressured into selling valuable artwork later died under suspicious circumstances." The revelation sent a chill through Marcus as he realized how much danger Elena had faced during her years of resistance to Meridian's acquisition efforts. His aunt had essentially been conducting a one-person investigation into organized crime, risking her life to preserve evidence that could bring justice to victims of corporate fraud and potentially prevent future crimes. "Why didn't she contact law enforcement herself?" Marcus asked. "She tried," Agent Chen replied, showing them correspondence between Elena and various federal agencies that had been ignored or dismissed due to insufficient evidence. But individual complaints about aggressive business practices are difficult to prosecute without a pattern of criminal behavior. Elena understood that she needed comprehensive documentation before authorities would take action. Dr. Harrison was studying Elena's research methodology with obvious professional admiration. She approached this like an academic investigation, building evidence systematically over years until she had an irrefutable case. And now that case is going to destroy Meridian's entire operation, Agent Chen added with satisfaction. "By tomorrow morning, we'll have search warrants for their offices, bank records, and communications systems. By the end of the week, their key personnel will be under arrest." The speed with which federal law enforcement moved against Meridian exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 48 hours of Agent Chen's review of Elena's files, FBI raids targeted Meridian offices in 5 states simultaneously, seizing financial records, computer systems, and communications that documented years of criminal activity. The raids made national news, with art industry publications describing the investigation as the largest prosecution of acquisition fraud in federal history. Marcus watched news coverage of the raids from the museum's conference room, feeling surreal satisfaction as he saw Victoria Sterling being led away in handcuffs outside Meridian's Chicago headquarters. The woman who had threatened his family just days earlier now faced federal charges that could result in decades in prison, her corporate authority reduced to nothing by Elena's careful documentation of criminal behavior. "Dad, look," Sofia said, pointing to a news report that showed FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence from Meridian's New York office. "They're finding all the proof that Aunt Elena collected." Marcus pulled his daughter close, marveling at how quickly their situation had transformed from desperate defense against corporate intimidation to victory in a federal investigation that would reshape the art acquisition industry. Elena's legacy extended far beyond the valuable collection she'd preserved. She'd also created the foundation for bringing justice to victims of systematic fraud while protecting future collectors from similar exploitation. Dr. Harrison joined them in watching the news coverage, his expression reflecting professional satisfaction with how the investigation was proceeding. "This is exactly what Elena hoped would happen," he said. She knew that her documentation could stop Meridian from victimizing other people, and she was willing to risk everything to make that possible. Professor Walsh had been following art industry reactions to the Meridian investigation, finding widespread support for federal action against companies that used intimidation to acquire valuable collections. "The entire legitimate art world has been waiting for something like this," she reported. Meridian's practices were damaging the industry's reputation and making collectors afraid to work with reputable dealers. As the federal investigation dominated headlines, Marcus and Sofia found themselves at the center of a media story that transformed their family's struggle into a symbol of resistance against corporate greed. News outlets described their discovery of Elena's collection as the breakthrough that exposed systematic fraud affecting the entire art market, with Sofia's role in finding the hidden paintings particularly capturing public imagination. 10-year-old discovers aunt's secret art collection worth millions while helping FBI expose criminal conspiracy. Read one headline that made Sofia giggle with embarrassment, while also making her proud of their contribution to bringing justice to Elena's memory. Marcus was initially reluctant to participate in media interviews, preferring to keep their family's private struggles out of public attention. But Dr. Harrison convinced him that sharing their story could help other families avoid similar exploitation, while also generating support for Elena's vision of making significant artwork accessible to public institutions. "Your story demonstrates that ordinary people can stand up to corporate intimidation when they have proper support and information," Dr. Harrison argued. "Elena's documentation only became powerful when you had the courage to use it." The media attention also accelerated authentication of Elena's collection, with art experts from major museums and universities volunteering their services to evaluate pieces that had been hidden for decades. The collaborative effort revealed treasures that exceeded even Dr. Harrison's optimistic projections, establishing Elena's collection as one of the most significant private holdings of 20th-century American art ever discovered. "We've identified works by 43 different artists," Dr. Harrison reported during a press conference at the Cleveland Museum of Art. "The total value appears to exceed $50 million, with several pieces being unique examples of important artists, work that were previously unknown to art historians." Sofia stood beside her father during the press conference, fielding questions from reporters with poise that impressed everyone present. When asked about her role in discovering the collection, she emphasized Elena's decades of careful preservation rather than her own contributions to finding the hidden paintings. "My aunt did all the hard work," Sofia explained to a room full of adult journalists. "She protected these paintings for her whole life, so that someday people could see them and learn from them. We just found what she left for us." The simplicity and wisdom of Sofia's response resonated with media coverage that portrayed the Rivera family as reluctant heroes who had honored Elena's legacy while exposing criminal behavior that had damaged the art world for years. Their story became a symbol of how individual courage could triumph over corporate corruption when supported by institutions committed to justice and cultural preservation. But the most meaningful validation came from unexpected sources. Marcus received letters from other families who had been pressured by Meridian and similar companies, thanking him for having the courage to resist intimidation that they had succumbed to under similar circumstances. Some writers described losing family heirlooms or valuable collections to aggressive dealers who had used tactics identical to those Elena had documented. "We sold my grandmother's paintings for $10,000 to a company that told us they weren't worth more," wrote one woman from Detroit. "Last week I saw one of those paintings sell at auction for $200,000. Thank you for making sure these criminals can't hurt other families." Sofia read these letters with intense attention, understanding instinctively that their resistance to Meridian's pressure had protected other people from similar exploitation. The knowledge that Elena's documentation was preventing future crimes added moral weight to their legal victory that extended far beyond personal vindication. Aunt Elena saved more than just paintings, Sofia observed during one of their evening conversations about the ongoing investigation. She saved other families from getting hurt by these bad people. Marcus nodded, recognizing that his daughter understood the broader implications of what they'd accomplished better than many adults who focused only on the financial aspects of their discovery. Elena's true legacy wasn't the monetary value of her collection, but the justice she'd made possible for victims of corporate fraud and the protection she'd provided for future collectors. The resolution of their legal situation allowed Marcus and Sofia to focus on the question that had been postponed during their conflict with Meridian. What should happen to Elena's collection now that its value and authenticity had been established beyond dispute? Dr. Harrison presented several options that balanced financial considerations with Elena's apparent desire to make significant artwork accessible to the public. The Cleveland Museum of Art wanted to acquire key pieces for their permanent collection, offering prices that reflected the work's authenticated value, while also providing tax benefits that would maximize Marcus and Sofia's financial return. We could also help you establish the Elena Vasquez Foundation, Dr. Harrison suggested. That would preserve the collection as a complete entity while providing income through carefully managed loans to museums and educational institutions. Sofia had been developing her own ideas about how Elena's collection should be shared with the world, informed by her growing understanding of art history and museum practices. Her proposal surprised the adults with its sophistication and generosity. What if we keep some of the paintings that tell the story of Cleveland and families like ours and let museums borrow them so people everywhere can see them? Sofia suggested. And we could use money from selling other paintings to help kids who want to study art but can't afford it. Marcus studied his daughter's proposal, recognizing that Sofia had instinctively identified a solution that honored Elena's values, while also addressing their family's practical needs. Retaining key pieces that documented their city's cultural history would preserve the collection's educational value, while generating income to support Sofia's education and artistic development. That sounds like exactly what Elena would have wanted, Professor Walsh said approvingly. Art that serves communities instead of enriching corporations. The plan they ultimately developed balanced all of these considerations while establishing a model for how significant private collections could benefit broader communities. The Elena Vasquez Foundation would preserve the collection's most historically important pieces while generating income through strategic sales and museum partnerships, with proceeds funding scholarships for young artists from working-class families like Sofia's. Elena spent her life protecting these paintings so they could eventually help people, Marcus explained during the foundation's announcement ceremony. Now they'll support the next generation of artists who might not otherwise have opportunities to develop their talents. Sofia cut the ribbon at the ceremony, surrounded by art students from Cleveland's public schools who would be among the first beneficiaries of the foundation's scholarship programs. The image of a young girl ensuring that other children could pursue artistic education captured public imagination in ways that reinforced the moral victory Elena's legacy had achieved. The financial transformation of Marcus and Sofia's circumstances was dramatic, but carefully managed to preserve the values that had guided their resistance to Meridian's pressure. Instead of sudden wealth that might have corrupted their judgment, they received structured income that ensured long-term security while maintaining their connection to the community where Elena had chosen to preserve her collection. Marcus was able to leave his job search behind and focus full-time on managing the foundation and supporting Sofia's artistic education. Sofia enrolled in advanced art classes at the Cleveland Institute of Art, studying techniques in art history that connected her natural talent with formal training that Elena's legacy made possible. "I want to paint pictures that tell stories about families like ours," Sofia explained to her new teachers. "Stories about people who do the right thing even when it's hard." The transformation of the abandoned warehouse into the Elena Vasquez Community Art Center provided a permanent home for the foundation's activities, while creating educational opportunities for young artists throughout Cleveland. The same space where Marcus and Sofia had discovered Elena's hidden collection now hosted classes, exhibitions, and workshops that made high-quality art education accessible to children whose families couldn't afford private instruction. From the beginning, Elena understood that art belongs to communities, not corporations. Dr. Harrison said during the Art Center's opening celebration, "This facility ensures that her vision will continue inspiring young artists for generations." Marcus stood in the warehouse's main gallery, surrounded by Elena's paintings and watching Sofia teach younger children about color theory and composition, feeling a sense of completion that went beyond financial security or public recognition. They had honored Elena's trust, protected her legacy from corporate exploitation, and created something that would benefit their community long after their own involvement ended. The federal prosecution of Meridian's leadership resulted in convictions that sent shockwaves through the art acquisition industry, establishing legal precedents that would protect collectors from similar exploitation in the future. Victoria Sterling received a 15-year sentence for racketeering and fraud, while Meridian's corporate structure was dismantled and its assets distributed to victims of their criminal activities. Elena's documentation was so comprehensive that most defendants pled guilty rather than face trial. Agent Chen reported during a victim impact hearing, where Marcus represented all of the families Meridian had defrauded. Her work essentially guaranteed that justice would be served. The legal victory provided closure for Elena's decades of resistance while also establishing Marcus and Sofia as advocates for art world reform, who could speak with authority about protecting cultural treasures from corporate predators. They testified before congressional committees investigating art industry practices, consulted with law enforcement agencies developing strategies for preventing acquisition fraud, and worked with educational institutions creating programs to help collectors understand their rights and responsibilities. But the most satisfying recognition came from sources that Elena would have appreciated most. Art historians credited her collection with filling significant gaps in documentation of 20th-century American cultural development, while museum curators praised her preservation techniques that had maintained the paintings in pristine condition despite decades of storage in an abandoned warehouse. Elena Vasquez was essentially operating as a one-person museum for 30 years, wrote one prominent art critic. Her dedication to cultural preservation while resisting corporate exploitation sets a standard that institutions worldwide should emulate. Sofia framed that review and hung it in her bedroom, alongside reproductions of Elena's paintings and photographs from the Art Center's community programs. At 11 years old, she understood that their family's story had become part of Cleveland's cultural history, inspiring other people to protect valuable artwork while supporting educational opportunities that Elena's legacy had made possible. "Dad," Sofia said one evening as they walked through the Art Center's galleries, observing students whose scholarships allowed them to develop talents that might otherwise have gone unrecognized. "Do you think we did good?" Marcus pulled his daughter close, surrounded by evidence of how Elena's careful planning had transformed their desperate circumstances into lasting contributions to their community's cultural development. The warehouse that had initially seemed like a burden had become the foundation for educational programs, artistic preservation, and legal reforms that would protect future generations from the corporate exploitation Elena had spent her life fighting. "I think we did exactly what Elena hoped we would do," Marcus replied, "and I think your mom would be proud of the person you're becoming." Sofia smiled and returned her attention to a group of young artists who were creating murals inspired by Elena's collection, their work continuing the tradition of community-based cultural preservation that had guided Elena's vision from the beginning. The girl whose artistic curiosity had led to discovering millions of dollars worth of hidden paintings was now helping other children develop their own creative abilities, ensuring that Elena's legacy would inspire future generations of artists who understood that cultural treasures belonged to communities rather than corporations. As evening fell over Cleveland and the Art Center prepared to close for the day, Marcus and Sofia walked home through neighborhoods where Elena had lived and worked for decades, preserving a secret that would eventually transform their lives while exposing criminal behavior that had damaged countless other families. Their inheritance had indeed been worth far more than money, providing them with purpose, community, and the knowledge that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when guided by principles that prioritized cultural preservation over personal profit. The warehouse's transformation from abandoned industrial building to thriving community art center stood as a permanent monument to Elena's vision and Marcus and Sofia's courage in honoring her trust despite overwhelming pressure to abandon their principles for immediate financial gain. Elena's paintings continued telling stories about American families and communities, now accessible to visitors who could appreciate both their artistic merit and their historical significance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.